Deputy Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Mr. Patrick and Mr. Menton for coming in today. It's quite a number of issues I'd like to touch upon, actually, about 5. So, Chair, if you want to break, and I might come in a second time, just to be fair to Deputy O'Donnell, so if he wants to come in, just to...
You get as you go down.
Yeah, thank you. The first is in relation to, earlier you said...
Before you start, that there is a time issue here because Mr. Fitzpatrick is going to another meeting, so just to remind you of that.
Okay, thanks. So I'll try and expedite what I wanted to ask. You said nothing inside the agreement has threatened the agreement so far, earlier on. Nothing inside the agreement had threatened it. Can something outside the agreement threaten it?
Well, I think, Deputy, in industrial relations, one never knows what's around the corner. So far, the agreement has robustly coped with whatever has come its way. And as I said earlier, big ticket items have come its way. Gave some examples of real money, people losing real money. Apart from the pay cut, this is on top of that. Could something happen? Of course something could happen. Do I know of anything that's going to happen at the moment? No. But that's not to say something couldn't happen.
Allowances and increments don't come under the agreement.
They're not provided for in the agreement.
I take that as, on my read, they don't come under the agreement. That's how I take that. So
I think that's...
Do you think in your interpretation then of the agreement, allowances and increments is something outside the agreement, could they threaten the agreement if they were put on?
I'm certainly going to let the staff side, the trade union representatives, speak for themselves on that, because
I'm just interested as to an interpretation of the break clause.
The reality is, anything could threaten the agreement. Yeah, but whether those would or not, that's a matter for the trade unions. I really couldn't speculate on that.
People talk about the break clause in the agreement. It's paragraph 1.28, page 10, I think, of the Croke agreement. And they talk about the government taking, might want to initiate at some stage, and the agreement, the break clause itself says the implementation of this agreement is subject to no currently unforeseen budgetary deterioration. Now, from my reading of that, it looks like the break clause can only be implemented by the government side of this agreement, and only they can then choose that Croke is no longer.
That's probably true in that sense. But on the other hand, I read, it really is a matter for the employer and the trade unions. And I'm not trying to be unhelpful, and I certainly wouldn't be unhelpful. But I don't think for me as chairman, because I could end up, I don't think it would be helpful for me to speculate on this, because it is out there at the moment there's a lot of debate around these issues. A circular has gone out in the last day or two on some allowances. So I think, Deputy, it would be really unhelpful. It's really a matter of, I think, how that's dealt with is really a matter for the employer and the trade union.
I don't want to put you in a difficult position. My own thinking on this is I agree with the Fiscal Advisory Council that everything should be on the table as we discuss the coming budget and the adjustment that has to be made. I think that includes increments and allowances. I'm trying to figure out, though, as to an interpretation of the break clause, whether one could justifiably use a discussion around increments and allowances as a reason to break Croke Park on the other side. From my reading of the break clause, you couldn't. And I think, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but
Well, it would depend, I suppose, if whether or not somebody was arguing that the agreement was being breached.
But if increments and allowances don't come under the agreement, then they're outside of the agreement. And so, therefore, something outside of the agreement couldn't really breach the agreement, particularly if the agreement can only be breached by the government side, and only because of budgetary deterioration.
And the agreement is silent. There's nothing in the agreement about the two issues you mentioned. But I think it will boil down to definition of pay.
Definition of pay. And is pay defined anywhere in the agreement?
Not. Well, I'm just trying to remember now. Well, certainly there's not a detailed definition.
Where did that definition come from? If it's not in the agreement, how does it then become defined?
It is really a matter between the employers and the trade unions.
To define what
it's really not a matter for the implementation body.
Okay. So even though the word allowances doesn't appear in the document,
no,
or increments.
What the agreement specifically states is that there will be no further reductions in the pay rates of serving public servants for the lifetime of the agreement. This commitment is subject to compliance with the terms of this agreement. And that's all it says.
Yeah, so there's no mention of increments, there's no mention of allowance, it does mention pay rates. So if the employer and the unions then decided that they were going to define core pay, they could decide whether or not it included allowance.
Absolutely, they could, of course, decide. It's a matter for the employer. If the trade union...
But if the employer was to decide that it wanted to define pay rates as not including allowances and increments, on your read of the break clause, would that give a right to the other side to then pull out of the agreement?
I think that the break clause obviously is for a particular set of circumstances vis-a-vis, and you find that in the private sector as well, where you'll find most agreements will have a clause that if the trading position is such that. So I think what it would boil down to is whether or not the proposal was regarded by the trade unions as a breach of the agreement. That's
Yeah.
But
It's just because when I read the break clause, and it was written in 2010, excuse me, it seems to indicate that this agreement stands unless the budgetary situation for the country gets worse.
yeah, and you get that in every previous agreement has something similar. Yeah.
So I don't see how from that, if the government decided that it was going to define pay rates as not including allowances and increments, that it would be a valid excuse for the unions to then pull out of the agreement.
That'll be a matter for others to defend if they decide that. It doesn't matter absolutely between the unions and the employer.
Okay, thank you. The next thing is just about reporting, just a brief point in relation to the report of that you issued, the June report. And you mentioned the agreement itself and the appendices at the end of it and the list of different things to measure. I wonder if for the next report we might have essentially the appendices, and after each point that is in them, an update there as to what has happened on that point. So,
The agreement.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to do this ourselves in my former place of employment.
Yeah.
And you literally say, implemented, coming in 2 months, difficulties. So we could actually go down through it and go, well, how much of this is actually done? Because as Deputy Donoghue said, this is a good report, June. It's an improvement on the previous one, but I think we can go further in terms of the detail that we provide.
Chairman, we can certainly do that, but just to make the point as well that I suppose the agreement is, we certainly do that because there is a list for each sector, but the agreement has now gone far beyond that, in that there's a lot of things that weren't in those lists that have been done. So,
you know what I mean? I can include them and
Yeah.
let people know that we've done all this in this sector, ticked all these boxes, and we've done these extra things as well.
a summary of progress, total progress to date, if you like.
It would be really helpful to have, actually. I think from all sides of the table.
Yeah.
Those who wouldn't be so favourable to the agreement and those
Yeah.
who are, you know.
Okay.
Thank you.
And we can identify then the ones that were specifically in the appendices.
Okay, thank you. The next point I wanted to touch on was in relation to the implementation body itself. And I suppose its mandate or its terms of reference. Who is the implementation body working for? Yeah, working for.
Well, we report to the government, to the minister and the government, and so it's really for government.
In whose interest are you acting?
Sorry?
In whose interest are you acting? Is it the public sector, or is it the public, or is it the unions, or is it the department?
Well, I think you need to answer that question. You need to look at whose interest is the agreement in, and the agreement was actually designed to enable the government to reduce the deficit. So, to that extent, if you like, all of this is about enabling the government, the last government and the present government, to reduce the public service spend and to narrow the deficit between income and expenditure. So in that sense, it's in the national interest. But we absolutely, because public services are not there to serve themselves.
Is there anyone from outside the public sector represented in the implementation body?
No, there are 4 management representatives and 4 trade union representatives, and I chair it as an independent chair.
So there's no one from outside the public sector, and this is the national interest, a member of the implementation body that is an agreement that concerns work practices, pay and everything else in the public sector.
It's an agreement, as I understand it, the rationale for the membership was based on the fact that it was an industrial relations agreement between the government and the trade unions.
So the members then from the unions are acting in the interests of their union members?
Well, I think if you look at the progress so far, a lot of that has been in the national interest.
You look at the progress, though, through your eyes, through the eyes of the implementation body. So
Yeah.
if the members of the implementation body are acting within a particular interest that's not necessarily the national one, I can't see that. I can't see that in how they make conclusions or the recommendations that they draw. We have this discussion around members of boards of banks, for example. Who are the members of the boards that were appointed by, be it the government or whoever else, whose interest were they working? And once they went on the board, they were working in the shareholders' interest, not the public interest, not the national interest. And if you have a member from a union there, that person is there for a reason on that board. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any members from the union there, but surely they're only acting in the union's interests.
Well, I would have to say, as the independent chair, what I observe people doing, genuinely say this, is that both the trade union and the management representatives on the body are acting to make the agreement work. And many of their members are taking significant pain. If you take some of the groups I mentioned who've lost because of the new working day, the extended working days.
I'm not doubting the changes. I'm not doubting some of the changes. My point is in relation to a conflict of interest that might arise about an objective bias. Someone might go in and sit down and go, okay, I'm a member of the union, but I'm here, this is a national agreement, I'm going to work in the national interest, but their own bias is given their own background. You can't get around objective bias in that instance. I mean, do you think that we should have someone from outside the public
Well,
sector?
it doesn't matter. Again, the implementation body is a creation of the agreement. It was agreed between the employers and the trade unions when they negotiated the agreement. So it's not for me to determine.
Chair, as the independent chair, who's independent from all of this, would you find it more helpful if you had external eyes?
I'm certainly not constrained by anybody on the group at the moment.
But
There's no
again,
constraint. I'm not in any way constrained at the moment. And it really is a matter for the parties to decide who is on the body.
I think we're straying into an area that maybe you can't
Yeah.
speak
Thank
more
you.
about. Okay,
Thanks.
you. The next thing I wanted to raise was in relation to the methodology for calculating savings, pay and non-pay, and the overestimation that we saw in the Department of Agriculture.
Sorry. It was underestimated.
Underestimated, yeah, sorry. They underestimated the savings that were achieved, but they underestimated them because they didn't agree with the guidelines for calculating savings that were then put in by Grant Thornton, was it?
What happened was...
They thought it was, in fact, to use the guidelines that come from the RIA, which are the ones, regular impact analysis, the ones that are meant to be used. Their opinion was that they overestimated the actual savings because there's 40% that you put on top.
What Grant Thornton said was that they underestimated the saving because they didn't allow for the 40% that is per the formula that's used by the department. And the second underestimation was that they calculated the salaries on the midpoint of the scale rather than the max. Most people were on the max.
The point, so I don't want to actually talk about that. That's okay. I want to talk about the 40% allocation for non-paid costs. So we're calculating a savings, say, from moving people out of an office. The way it's done, according to the guidelines that was devised by the public sector, is that you add an additional 40% of the salary to make up for things of gas and overheads and things.
Yeah.
And the Department of Agriculture said that the 40% allocation for non-paid costs, while in line with Department of Finance guidelines, was considered excessive, related to the actual costs incurred. So are our numbers for what we are saving, are they actually inflated by potentially 40%? If the Department of Agriculture doesn't agree with the guidelines, why are we using them?
Well, first of all, the number of situations that arise is very, very small, because it only arises where offices are being closed. And departments and agencies don't have a choice in terms of whether or not to follow the guidance from the department. They should follow the guidance from the department, and that's what happened here.
Here's the department saying that it doesn't think the guidelines are any good, and then Grant Thornton...
Different issue, sorry, Chairman. That's an issue then that...
Yeah. Grant Thornton concluded that we are satisfied that the reasons for undervaluing the declared savings are adequate and understandable. So Grant Thornton seems to be saying that they agree with the initial estimates that the department provided, but had to increase those estimates in line with the Department of Finance guidelines. So we're building up the savings that we're making, yet the department itself is saying that they're not necessarily justified. And we have an independent consultant saying that we understand that point that they were making initially.
Sorry, it was the accountants doing the verification that actually identified the 40%.
Because they had to do the verification in line with these guidelines, because they were told to do it in line with the guidelines. So They're making calculations not how they would make them, but how the government has told them how to make them. And how the government tells them how to make them inflates them by 40%, according to people in the Department of Agriculture. That's what I can't understand. I mean, so when we talk about
That's an issue as to whether the guidelines are right or wrong. Then that's a different.
You're the independent chair. Do you have a view on the guidelines for calculating pay?
Sorry?
Do you have a view on the guildelines for calculating pay? Is it
I assume I'm not an accountant, by the way. So I assume that the guidelines are that if the guidelines are there, in the same way as there are guidelines for value in land or whatever, that if there are guidelines there, they have to be complied with. And whether they're right or wrong is a different issue, a different debate.
Accountants who might be involved in this kind of work, say regularly, so who would work for one of the big houses, and they said they wouldn't calculate things this way. And when you look at the actual relevant appendix, which is Appendix F from the guidelines from 2009, and you see how they do it, I mean, it's the total staff cost is plus 40% in respect of overheads. And that can be defined in any number of ways.
But that's really, I'm sorry, Chairman, but that issue is really, is whether or not the guidelines are right. It's not whether or not Grant Thornton.
Guidelines were devised by the public sector.
They're defined by the department. We don't have any involvement in that.
I know, but what I'm talking about
That's an accounting issue.
Someone says to me, look, you've got to reduce your pay. And I say, okay, I'll do that, but I'm going to determine how I calculate how I've made that reduction. I mean, that's not necessarily objective at all. And here we have an independent report from Grant Thornton giving the reason that the department gives and then saying, we find this reason adequate and understandable as to why they didn't go with the guidelines initially, because they felt it was excessive. And then I look at a figure of 678 million since the beginning of agreement in non-pay related savings, and I'm wondering, is it inflated?
No. What I can say to you is that the particular issue you mentioned, there's so few savings, so little. The only areas, it only arises where staff numbers were reduced and offices closed. And the areas where that happened was some in Chagas, some in agriculture.
But this is how we're calculating pay as well.
But it's not, no,
formula.
no, it's not. Absolutely not. I can assure you on that, Deputy. Sorry, it's not. I wouldn't like that impression to go out.
Okay, so 40%.
Absolutely assure you that that is not factored into the general pay.
The total staff cost, when we're looking at savings and salaries, is not the figure that's used.
It's the actual salaries. It's not. There's no percentage added to the total.
I don't see actual salaries. All I have is pay,
sorry, no,
direct salary, total salary, total staff cost.
Absolutely. Just to be absolutely crystal clear, the total salary saving that we have from the Department of Public Expenditure is based on salaries and salaries only. It's not based on overheads. There's nothing. Sorry, there's no provision in there for overheads.
Sorry, because I'm just going by what's here in the appendix for calculating it. Staff costs includes the 40% overhead. That's what it says here.
No, I think we're talking two separate things here, actually.
Okay,
Sorry,
you can clarify it for me.
Sorry?
Can you clarify that? Because I'm not quite sure.
Well, we'll certainly clarify,
Yeah.
but I can absolutely assure you that the pay bill, because we've been absolutely meticulous with this, the pay bill savings that we report are the actual pay, and there's nothing added to those.
Okay, but then can I put it to you that the savings that the agriculture reported initially are more accurate than the ones that actually ended up? So it actually wasn't value, it was their valuation, which was an accurate one, because they felt that the Department of Finance guidelines bloated their estimation of savings.
In the figures that we would have used from the department, that 40% would not have been included, even for that limited number of people.
But in this report it said they were.
No, for that particular project, when they were evaluating the project.
Exactly, and so the savings...
Which involved not just pay, it involved, they were looking at the non-pay. They were looking, in other words, the total savings, pay and non-pay, from the closure of offices, essentially. That's what they were looking at.
Yeah.
And initially the department just took into account the rent that was being paid.
Yeah.
And
Public expenditure.
I think
it's an interesting point.
I think it's more of an accounting technical issue, Chairman, yeah.
We're talking about the difference was 10 million in terms of what agriculture reported. They under-reported by 10 million.
I want to make it very...
On that point.
Yeah, but for the avoidance of any doubt,
Yeah.
and really important, for the avoidance of absolutely any doubt, the one thing I can say without fear of contradiction here is that the pay bill savings that we've reported in the main report do not include anything except the actual pay.
Okay.
Nothing. The 650 million, the 590 million adjusted for the for the 5.2, whatever it is, adjusted for
But those
the...
figures include the Department of Agriculture's figures, which it says are...
No, those figures include the Department of Agriculture salaries only.
But surely it's here in terms of non-pay
No.
costs.
No.
So in our
Sorry.
total non-pay cost figure, we've gone back to the Department of Agriculture's
Oh, sorry,
figure.
in the
and that's-
non-pay figure, sorry, sorry, my apology. On the non-pay figure, yes.
Yeah.
But,
Sorry,
yeah,
thanks.
yeah,
This is what I'm
sorry.
trying to get at.
Sorry, no, sorry.
Perhaps that's my
No, sorry, on the
mistake.
pay,
Non-pay
yeah,
costs.
Yeah, yeah.
Agriculture thinks that the way we calculate them is excessive.
But that's the formula that's been used,
Right.
so...
My
the chairman said it's a
question
matter
is
for somebody
maybe we
else.
should change the formula. Because
Well,
there's
that's
a
a matter
10
of-
million difference. So if we're going around saying, look at all these great savings, and the departments are kind of going, well, actually, they're probably overestimated by 40%, but don't tell anyone, then the savings aren't actually savings.
Well, I think, Chairman, that's a matter really,
Well, Chair, I think that's something that, I mean, this is the Public Accounts Committee. I mean, I know you're
No,
the Chair, and I'm
I-
not, no. But like, if there's a problem with how we're actually calculating non-pay costs in the Croke Park Agreement, if the Department of Agriculture itself doesn't agree with how we do it, independent consultants have said they understand why the department would think that. We need to look again at how we're calculating savings. It's very basic stuff.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, no,
Sorry,
please.
Chairman, just to be very clear, the only situation that would arise in is where offices have been closed. And the only situation where offices were closed, I think, were Chagas and Department of Agriculture.
10 million here.
One or two.
It's 10 million.
I'm not saying...
Yeah, and that's
no,
significant
I'm not
enough
disputing
figure.
that. My
We're
main
talking
concern
about-
was that there wouldn't be an impression that the pay bill savings were...
Well, I'm interested in non-pay and how we
Non-pay,
calculate these things.
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting discrepancy there in terms of what we're doing.
Okay.
And it's something that hasn't been addressed. It needs to be addressed, I think, Chair.
We can send
Yeah.
a transcript of the meeting to PER and ask them to comment on it.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to continue on this area, if I could, again with agriculture, because we were
Do you
talking
want
about...
to allow Deputy Allen to ask a question?
Sorry.